Today on the Roundhouse, we're talking to the president of the American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 154 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. The Roundhouse is a Streamliner Media production. If your tourist railroad or freight railroad is looking for video marketing, I'd love to help you out, and you can learn more at streamlinermedia.com. Today, we are talking to Chuck Baker. He's the president of the American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association, which is sort of like an advocacy group for this element of the freight railroad industry. We're going to learn more about the role that organization plays and his outlook on short line railroading in 2025. Before we get to that, though, Streamliner Media, which is my company that specializes in video and digital media, is growing. And because of that, I'm looking for help in doing this really interesting work for some really neat clients. So if you specialize in video production, social media management, graphic design, web design, and you're looking for work, please reach out to me at streamlinermedia.com. I'd love to talk with you. Next, speaking of American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association, if you're listening to this in April of 2025, I will be attending the 2025 conference in Denver. So if you'll be there, flag me down, say hello. I always enjoy meeting people who listen to the podcast. I'd also like to thank those of you who are supporting the Roundhouse on Patreon. You could go to patreon.com/theroundhouse and get early access to episodes of the podcast. And I want to thank Jip Baker and Samuel Top for joining us. Your support is greatly appreciated. I also want to thank this episode's sponsor, the Strasburg Railroad Mechanical Services. You can learn more about their restoration services at mechanical.strasburgrailroad.com. Our guest today is the president of American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Chuck Baker.
Thanks for having me here. I'm thrilled to be here. First time on this podcast, but it's got a great reputation, and I'm happy to do it.
I'm glad to hear that our reputation precedes us collectively, especially since you have a unique position with your organization to see so much that's going on nationally with railroading. A good starting point for this is, what is American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association?
Sure. So it's probably easier to start with what is a shortline railroad. And we'll, hopefully, I would imagine a lot of people listening already know that, but maybe perhaps not everybody. So shortline railroads are the small freight railroads in the industry. Technically, that's the class 2 and 3 railroads, which is a revenue distinction, but sort of more colloquially, they're just the smaller freight railroads. And there are, and not a lot of people know this, but there are 600 of them in the country. And the way I typically explain that to people who don't know a lot about it is I use sort of different analogies. One of them is the standard kind of tree analogy, right? Like that the class 1 railroads are the trunk lines throughout the country and the short lines are the branch lines. Sometimes I'll use the airline analogy, like the class 1 railroads are United Airlines and short lines are United Express. Sometimes I'll use the human body analogy, like the class 1s are the arteries and veins and we're the capillaries, but it's all sort of the same point. We're the first and last mile railroads on the system. So there are There are 600 of them throughout the country, and basically, like almost every industry in the country, they found over time, and in my case, it was like 110 years ago, they found that there was a good use for having a trade association in Washington, D.C. to help them do collectively what doesn't make a lot of sense to do individually. So we run the association out of Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And we've got about 17 people who work for the association, but really much more importantly, we've got about 500 short-line railroad members of the association. And so what we do in DC is legislation, regulation, legal stuff. So we'll get into all those details, but we're on the Hill talking about grant programs, tax credit programs. We're at the FRA talking about various safety regulations, what's realistic for us to do, what we support, what we can't support, how to make it practical for small railroads. We're at the Surface Transportation Board talking about economic regulation, right? Whether it's reciprocal switching or revenue adequacy or programs like that. And then occasionally we file lawsuits. We try to never do that. That's not my favorite way to engage with other people, is to sue them, but occasionally the association does that. Sometimes we're filing amicus briefs. And so that's really the core of what an association typically does, is like legislation, regulation, litigation, that sort of thing. But then we can also get into this, you also end up doing best practices, producing templates. We have various committees where a lot of work of the association gets done. And then we put on events. We help our members kind of get together at conferences. And we do that partially because it's fun, partially because providing a venue for our members to meet each other and network is really useful. And then partially because you can actually make pretty decent money doing that. And we're a nonprofit, but we take that money and invest it right back into the legislative and regulatory and legal work we do. So the events also kind of support the basic functioning of the association. So none of that is super unique in the world of associations, but that's what we do.
You mentioned the term class 1, class 2, class 3, and these are terms that I think even those of us who are deep entrenched in railroading kind of take for granted their existence. Clay Sink Branchline on Facebook asks if you could define each, and I will add to that, what are the benefits by having these definitions, both within the industry and how we collectively communicate what this industry is?
Technically speaking, or legally speaking, they are revenue distinctions. So class 1 railroad is any railroad in the United States that does more than about $1 billion. The number changes slightly every year, but more than about $1 billion in revenue. It turns out that in North American freight railroading, there's only 6 of those, right? And it's the ones that everyone has heard of, even people who have no experience with the rail industry: BNSF, Union Pacific, Norfolk Southern, CSX, CPKC, and Canadian National. So those are the 6 big class 1 railroads. I think the smallest of them is like close to $10 billion in revenue. I think UP is closer to $25 billion in revenue, if I've got my recent numbers right. So none of them it's not like any of them are on the border between class 1 and class 2. They are all very, very solidly class 1 territory. They're the big ones. They're Fortune 500 companies, and they're typically have 20,000 plus miles of track each. There are class 2 is between about $45 million in revenue and about $1 billion in revenue. Practically speaking, I don't think there's any class 2 that's even north of 500 million. There's probably about 20 class 2 railroads in the country, and some people have heard of all of them, like Florida East Coast, Wheeling and Lake Erie, Rapid City Pier and Eastern, Iowa Interstate, Buffalo and Pittsburgh. So they're the kind of the bigger short lines. Sometimes people colloquially call them regional railroads. That's not really a legal term, but it sort of better describes like a bigger short line. And then the vast, vast majority of short line railroads are class 3, which is under 45 million in revenue. Some of them, there's about 600 of those. Some of them are at like 38 million or 41 million and are pretty close. A lot of those are more like 2 million or 3 million. There can be some very, very small business uh, class three railroads. You could have one that has 4 employees, one locomotive, and 2 customers, and they run 2 trains a week and they might do, a couple thousand carloads in a year. And so that's kind of what class one, class two, class three are. It's an interesting mix. Like I said, those are all legal terms. People tend to use the class one legal term like commonly, like at least in DC, you frequently hear people talk about the class one railroads. But then for the class two and three railroads, people tend to not use that term and just call them all short line railroads. So go figure. I have no idea exactly why that is the habit, but that's sort of how the world has evolved. The question, your second part of your question is like, why do we do that and why does it matter? I don't actually have a fantastic answer to the question of like why we do that in the first place and how it got there, but it does tend to matter. There are a fair amount of regulations and legislation that applies differently to class one railroads versus class two and three railroads. For instance, there are PTC, positive train control, which is kind of a technology system on the railroads that apply much more to the class one railroads than to class two or three. Conversely, there's a tax credit, and we can get into that when we start to talk about policy and legislation. There is a tax credit that Congress passed that helps short line railroads maintain and invest in their infrastructure that is only eligible for class two and three railroads. Class ones can't get it, and which is fine because they don't ask for it, and they would typically say they don't need it. They're profitable companies, they make money, and they don't ask for government help for the infrastructure, and they don't want the strings. For class two and threes, particularly the class threes, we frequently need the help, and we're willing to take the strings that come with help. So there are quite a few regulations and pieces of law that affect big railroads differently than small, and that makes sense, right? There's laws that you could imagine like a regulatory requirement that it's one thing for a Fortune 500 company with a giant legal department to deal with versus a 10-person short line railroad that just realistically doesn't have anybody to do that, and it's not necessary. So the distinction is quite useful, and it's a big part of the way we talk about railroads, at least in DC.
Because you have this role where you're able to see so much of what's going on nationally with we'll call them short lines for convenience sake, even though we recognize that there's a lot of size difference within that field. What are some of the success stories that when you're talking to people outside of the industry and you want to highlight these are the real people and the real companies that are doing work in this sector, what are some of the stories that you like to highlight?
My job, it's still a job and they have to pay me to do it, but it is generally a real pleasure. And it's a pleasure because people like short line railroads, and they like short line railroads not because I do such a fabulous job of spinning the story. They like them because of what short line railroads do all day, every day. They're known for a very, very kind of high touch, friendly, customized, typically like labor intensive version of railroading that involves frequent communication with their customers and almost always involves saying yes. I was having this conversation with Ed Quinn, who's the CEO of RJ Corman, just a few weeks ago. And he basically said, he's like, when our customers ask the question, the answer is always yes. And then we go and figure out how to do it. And so they've only got a few customers, right? So they're very, very interested in keeping 100% of those customers and then trying to get one more. And so that means if the customer says like, hey, I need you to store these 20 rail cars for me for a month while I retool my plan. Like the answer is like, okay. And you might not have a place to do it, and that might not be in your business model, but you figure it out. And if the customer's like, hey, I know it's Sunday, but we got this big shipment in and we don't have room for all these cars, and so we need a second switch on Sunday night, the answer is yes. And it's like, okay, we're going to go figure out who's available to work. And sometimes if the president of the railroad is the only person who's available to work, he'll come and switch the cars himself on Sunday night. And so, those are the kind of stories that I love to tell, and they tend to go over very, very well. I was having a similar conversation with Rick Webb, who's the I think executive chairman, but the owner of Watco, which owns about 40 short line railroads. And he sort of said to me, he's like, if you just focus on keeping the customer happy, everything else flows from there. The class one relationship flows from there. The money flows from there. The regulatory support flows from there. The political support flows from there. Everything comes with just keep the customer happy. And I'll do one more story because it's a fun one, but this was on a panel at Rail Trends, which is a rail conference in New York a couple months ago. And there was a short line railroad who had they're down in Florida, and they had a customer who was looking to expand their site. And it's like kind of a heavy industry type site. And they're like a type of heavy manufacturing. And they were really, really struggling to find a location on the railroad that like would welcome this industry, because it's loud, it's noisy, there's trucks in and out and trains in and out, and neighbors aren't always super excited about that, even though it's good for the economy and all that. And so they literally couldn't find a site, but they explained the footprint they needed, and the railroad realized that footprint actually perfectly described the railroad's own headquarters. And so the short line said, like, I'll tell you what, you can have my headquarters site. We'll trade you, and we will go move somewhere else, because railroad headquarters is not heavy industry, right? It's like a few admin people and offices, and like that could go somewhere else. So that's sort of an extreme example, like take the shirt off my back, but that's the type of, kind of customized, friendly, like good neighbor type stuff that they're pretty good at.
You're talking to all these people, you're hearing all these perspectives from your members and your member organizations. And so you're taking that to Capitol Hill, and you know what they need. You know what the needs of the industry are, frequently around infrastructure, but often around policy. What are some of the ways in which your organization is advocating on Capitol Hill, and what are some of the outcomes that you've seen as a result from that work?
So one way to think about Capitol Hill and kind of what we do in DC is offense and defense, right? Like there's things we try to proactively make happen. That's playing offense. That's frankly much more fun. And then a fair amount of our time is unfortunately spent playing defense. And again, I don't know that that's super unusual to like railroading. I think that's like a lot of industries and organizations spend a lot of time trying to make sure that bad stuff doesn't happen to them. But so what you're asking about is the more fun side on offense, kind of what do we go try to get? And I would say the two biggest things we try to get are both really getting at the same issue, which is just funding for infrastructure, right? So short lines, if you go back to the origin story of kind of what short lines are, and I glossed over this a little bit at the beginning, right? Like we're the small branch lines off of the class one railroads. But if you go back to why we exist at all, if you go back a couple of generations, a lot of those small branch lines used to actually be owned by the bigger and larger railroads. They were branch lines off of those railroads. And over time, the larger railroads essentially were like, we can't make money on these branch lines. We can't serve them well. This is not working well for anybody. Like what we're good at is moving large trains, large distances relatively quickly. It's not highway speeds, but relatively quickly. And we do that, better than any freight rail system in the world. Like it's really the envy of the world, what the class ones are able to do over long distances. But to then take that $4 million locomotive and your two people in the crew who are both getting paid $130,000 a year, and to divert them off of the main line and to go mess around on a branch line and have to spend 3 hours per customer and go in and out of the gate and chit chat with the customer and like this kind of high touch, labor intensive stuff. It just didn't make a ton of sense for the class ones to do. And so what they did over time was they spun it out to the short lines, and the short line, would take over that line, and it became from the small town that it ended in to and connected to the class one main line, right? So that's how the short lines got formed. And so that's all good and it works the way I've described. The problem is, if you sort of think about how we got there, is there's a reason the class one didn't want that line in the first place. It is hard to make money. It's hard to run a successful railroad business if you only have a few customers. But that is the nature of what almost all short lines have. Now, that is why they're so focused on keeping what they have and so focused on trying to get one more. But nonetheless, they still have this problem where they have like 70 miles or 100 miles or 200 miles of track and maybe only a few customers. And it's just hard to make enough money to keep that infrastructure in good shape. So that is a long way of saying the biggest thing they want from Congress and the government is help with infrastructure investment. So there are basically two different ways we ask the federal government to help on that. One is through the 45G tax credit, which I sort of vaguely mentioned earlier when I talked about tax policy. 45G tax credit has been in Congress or been in the public code in law since 2005, and it provides $3,500 per track mile in a tax credit back if you invest 2.5 times that. So it's a 40 cents on the dollar tax credit, right? So 2.5 times 3,500 is 82.50. And so if you invest $8,250 per track mile you have, and then you fill out this little form when you fill out your taxes, you will get 40% of that, which is 3,500 back at the end of the year. And so it incentivizes short line railroads to invest more than they otherwise would, and it helps them afford it. And so we have done a huge amount of work over the past 2 decades trying to get that into the law in the first place, and then get it extended over and over, because a lot of times, and this is a whole separate podcast about why this is, but a lot of times when tax policy goes into the US code, it only goes in for 2 or 3 years at a time. And then you need to extend it over and over and over and over and over again. And so we've done that over and over and over again. It is currently in the code without an expiration date, which is fabulous. That finally happened in 2020 after 15 years of being in the code a couple years at a time. And now we're trying to actually increase that dollar amount to kind of catch up with inflation, because it's been $3,500 for 20 years at this point, and that doesn't quite buy what it used to, whether you're talking about ties or steel rail or labor or ballast or anything you would buy to do basic track maintenance. So that's one big thing that we go to Congress repeatedly for and get, and is very, very important to short lines. And then the other big thing is related, but is sort of a different approach. And these are grant programs. The biggest one in our world is the CRISI grant program. CRISI stands for, most people don't know this, and you don't need to, but Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements. And so that's a big grant program that Congress authorizes and appropriates money for, and then it goes to the Federal Railroad Administration, and they run an open kind of merit-based competition every year for it. And short lines apply along with passenger railroads and cities and states and counties, and it's for a pretty broad range of like rail infrastructure type investments. But short lines tend to apply and win for like 10, 20, $30 million projects, for big track rehab projects, bridge upgrades, and sometimes new locomotive purchases. So it's similar conceptually to 45G in the sense that it comes from the same place, that short line railroads need help with their infrastructure. Congress supports that idea and creates programs to help. It's a little different in the sense that 45G is like 3,500 per mile and is really aimed at like smaller maintenance type activities, where CRISI is really aimed at big transformational, like 10, $20 million projects that you could just never afford otherwise. And so those are really the two biggest things we've gone to Congress and asked for proactively over the years. And they're both, huge deals to short line, and really personally where I spend a disproportionately large amount of my time.
You wrote a piece for Railway Age about Chrissy and talking about the general success of the idea. And as part of that article, you highlighted Iowa Interstate's Bill Duggan Bridge project that they did, and you shared a video from that.
Yep.
I'm the guy who made the video for Iowa Interstate.
Right.
That was, and I've had the pleasure of doing a number of Chrissy highlight videos for short lines around the country. And it's really incredible to see this program that has such far reaching and, as you said, transformational qualities to what it's able to do to these entities that otherwise might not have the capital to be able to dedicate to such an initiative.
I wish more people would do these videos. That was really fabulous. And, to go on a slight tangent, the Iowa Interstate, that Bill Duggan Bridge video is so powerful for two reasons. One, because the program and the project itself are really useful, and it's a great example of what people use Chrissy for, right? It is not super complicated. We take this money and we invest it in the infrastructure, and then here's what the infrastructure looks like when it's done, and it's just very powerful to see it. It was also, we got a lot of mileage out of that one also because that project was done much quicker than a normal Chrissy project. And so one of our complaints, and we're careful about looking a gift horse in the mouth. We love Chrissy. I think one of the articles I wrote about Chrissy publicly was called An Ode to Chrissy, and it started with like the ways I love thee. We really love the Chrissy program, but nonetheless, it is frustratingly slow sometimes. The Bill Duggan Bridge was actually a counterexample. It was so fast, so we try to use that as an example of like they don't have to be this slow. Sometimes they can go pretty fast. But the videos are a really powerful way to get people to understand. One of our favorite tricks of the trade, and this is not like a great invention of mine, but we love to get members of Congress, governors, mayors, local officials, state DOT people, whatever. We love to get them out on the railroad themselves, like get a spike maul in their hand, let them sit up in the cab of the locomotive. People just like trains. They're blown away by how big they are. And it's very powerful to see it and feel it in person. But that is hard to do. And so that's on one end of like, that's awesome. The other end is like, I put on a suit and tie and I go into some congressional office and I talk to a 28-year-old staffer and I give them a boring policy paper and I just explain how important all this is. And like, I think I'm pretty good at that, but like it's boring sometimes. And I know they've had 11 meetings during the day on 11 different industries. And we're skeptical sometimes, even as we do that, of how effective that is. So somewhere in between those two is showing people the videos. And so it's not as good as getting them there in person, but it is better than just talking at them. And so we love those videos, and that was a really good one.
The Strasburg Railroad is an institution in the heritage railroad industry, and its Mechanical Services Department is proud to lead the way. With the knowledge and experience that has created one of the most reliable steam railroading experiences in the country, the Strasburg Railroad is excited to offer their expertise to the rest of the industry. Strasburg's professional team provides consulting and technical assistance to take your steam locomotive or rail car project from idea to finished product. They stand behind their work and always strive to meet their customers' needs for quality, historic accuracy, and reliability at a price that is fair. Unlike many competitors, they feature a fully equipped boiler, rail car, and machine shop, so the work gets done in-house, helping you get more for your money. Send your inquiries to mechanical@strasburgrailroad.com and let the professionals get to work for you. You mentioned earlier, as part of the organization's work, that you see yourselves in an education role, both inside the industry, providing resources to your member railroads, as well as outside the railroad to Congress people and the general public. What are some of the initiatives that you're involved with on both of those fronts?
For Congress, I think we, at the risk of repeating myself or boring people, I think we just sort of talked about it, but it's in a large part, my job is kind of explaining the story of short line railroading to Congress and translating that into what we want and what we don't want. Right. So we talked about Chrissy and we talked about 45G. Those are stories about what we do want. And it goes back to the origin story of where short lines came from, why Congress ought to care about helping, right? Like connecting these small towns and rural America to the national network. And if they don't help us, they risk going away, right? Because if you're the class one, your two options with this unprofitable, unloved branch line were sell it to the local short line or just abandon it and rip up the track. And so thank God they chose to sell it in most cases. And that's what we do. But there's no, we're not guaranteed to exist forever, right? These people are not running, they're not running charities. You don't necessarily have to get rich running a short line, but they can't do it at a loss forever. So we tell that story and we explain it to Congress a lot, and we talk about what we do want, and then we also talk about what we don't want, right? So whether that's sometimes it's a regulation, right, that we can't afford, whether that's like a track safety standard or a positive train control or putting in defect detectors or there's sort of an endless amount of rail regulations, rail car inspections, locomotive inspections, defect detectors, PTC, track safety standards, roadway worker protection, conductor certification, engineer certification, signalman certification, dispatcher certification. And we live with a lot of those. And we're not, one of the truisms in the rail industry is every regulation was written in blood, right? Like it is a dangerous activity, and we are not opposed to all regulation. And in fact, we live under quite a bit of safety regulation, not to mention economic regulation. But we try to be very careful on having more added that we don't think is productive or necessary. And we frankly use, the flip side of the same story, right? Like we're a small business, we're barely viable financially sometimes. In certain railroads. And so that's why we ask for Chrissy grants and 45G. And it's also why we try to be careful about putting on additional regulation that we don't think actually moves the dial on safety. Sometimes we think the regulation is sort of a job creating function, not a safety function. And so we try to be very, very careful about regulations that are just not practical for small businesses to live with. So that's a good example of what we use the stories for. And then similarly, another big area we play defense on is truck size and weight. So railroads compete typically with trucks, right? Like a given short line railroad, if it's in, let's say it's in Ashtabula, Ohio, and it goes to Cleveland, it's not really likely competing with another railroad. There's typically only one short line that would serve point A to point B. What it's really competing with is truck. And we would argue currently, even with the 23 cents a gallon diesel tax, the trucks already don't pay their fair share of highway maintenance. But there are constantly efforts to increase the size and weight of trucks allowed on the highways. Right now, the typical interstate highway rule says you can't have a truck heavier than 80,000 pounds. But there are some certain shippers, particularly ones who ship like lumber or beverages or various or rock heavy containers, that they want to increase that to 88,000, 97,000, 113,000. There's various proposals and various forms in various places. And we go to Congress frequently and make the case that the playing field is already unfair. It's already tilted towards trucks because the government is subsidizing them. And if you allow those trucks to get bigger and heavier, then you're making that problem worse. And you will now end up with, you'll shift the economics of trucking, which tilts the playing field farther away from rail. And you'll now end up with not only bigger trucks, but more of them too. So those are all like sort of ways we use the story of what railroads are to go tell it to, Congress, which is really, that's my primary audience, for better or for worse. Outside of like podcasts like this, perhaps I don't do frankly a whole lot of talking to like the public. I would probably love to, in some other alternate universe where we had 5 times as many employees at the association and a much bigger budget, I'd love to run ads talking about the beauty and majesty of freight railroading and what short line railroads do in your community, and you know, do public television shows and get on Sesame Street and talk to the kids and explain to people. And I think a lot of people would be interested to know, but the reality is freight railroading, even at the class 1 level, is kind of a behind the scenes thing. Most people don't know anything about it. Probably the people listening to this are already in like the 99th percentile of knowledge on rail. And I wish we could do more of that, but that's a tough, I frankly don't exactly know a great way to approach that, and I don't have a budget to go do it. So, if you can get a couple million listeners to this podcast, maybe we just play this for them.
I'm all for that. That sounds like a good plan to me. I was talking with a friend of mine the other day, and they said that they feel like they've seen this trend over the past 10 years where more short lines are becoming involved in the tourist railroad industry. And I wonder if you would agree that that is a trend and what your perspective on that is.
Yeah, 100%. That's definitely a trend. And there's sort of two different ways you can think about it, both of which are good. One is, and this is probably the trend I see the most, is an existing short line freight railroad that realizes, like, either because they're in a neat area, right? Maybe they're in Vermont and for 3 months in the fall, it's beautiful. Or maybe they're near the Ozarks, or maybe they're, whatever. You can imagine dozens of places that are just neat for people to see. They realize that, like, there are people who would be interested in riding on this kind of what they think of as a freight route. And maybe they come across somebody who has an old rail car who wants to send it, or an old steam locomotive. And again, like we talked about, they're small businesses. Sometimes they're just on the edge financially. They've got this low density track. And they're like, hey, you know what? On Saturdays in the fall, I could run a tourist train and make a little extra money. Maybe during college football Saturdays, I could run a little route to, a mile outside of, the stadium in the local college town or whatever. And they do it. It's a way to kind of serve the local community, be a good neighbor because there's demand for it, and just make a little bit of money and help keep the lights on. And so we're seeing a lot of that. And that fits to me right in with, like, the people who own these railroads are entrepreneurial. They hustle, right? They were kind of like hashtag hustle culture before that was a thing. And so maybe tourist is like their side hustle, right? And so they're always looking for what they can do. Maybe it's a murder mystery train. We had a railroad down in Florida that does that. So that's sort of one trend, is like the existing freight railroad that adds this on to make more. The other trend is just standalone tourist railroads, which is like they come across a section of track that's otherwise at risk of abandonment, and they just say the tourist railroad is going to be the business in and of itself. Like, that's all we're going to do. There's not as many of those because you got to run a lot of tourist trains to make enough money to keep up infrastructure and keep up, the rail cars and all the regulatory compliance. But if you can get volunteers, it can make that more viable. And if you're in a special area, like I rode a tourist train this summer in Colorado Springs up to, I'm going to blank on the name of it, which makes me maybe bad at my job, but it's the Pikes Peak. There you go, Pikes Peak Railway. And that's a spectacular tourist train. And that's a busy tourist area. And it's a really, like, world-class view. And it's just like a beautiful train ride up and down. And, like, that's popular enough that you can run multiple tourist trains all day, every day, all year round. And you can make you can make a viable business out of that. There's not a lot of those. But there's some. And so that's sort of a different version of a tourist train. But even companies like that can join the association, right? Because they still have regulatory compliance. They still have to deal with the FRA. we're not typically able to get them grants, right? Because our grants really are more about the concept of like uh, connecting small towns to the national freight rail network, and a tourist train sort of has a different logic to it, right? It's more of an entertainment function than it is an economic function. So there's sort of less of an obvious federal interest, but nonetheless, they're still railroaders, they're still railroading, and they're still very interested in kind of sharing education and best practices with fellow railroaders.
On the subject of tourist railroads and best practices, Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad asks, we're interested in what predictions he has for federal funding with administration changes. We saw significant changes between 2016 and 2020 and are curious what he thinks the future may hold for grant funding in particular. In their latest newsletter, there was a note about some changes in where we're turning in paperwork for steam engines, FRA restructure. Any other impacts we should anticipate?
Well, as we record this podcast on February 7th, gosh, I guess that puts us like 2.5 weeks into the new administration. Um, it is early to know. It has been an incredibly chaotic, kind of disruptive, unclear first couple of weeks of this new administration, and that's making no political judgment one way or the other, but there's a lot of uncertainty. More of that uncertainty exists in other parts of the government than it does in railroad grant funding. I think, in short, for like the types of grants and the types of programs that short line freight railroads are interested in, which are, CRISI primarily and 45G, I don't actually see a ton of disruption coming. I think it may be that some of the standard grant agreements get reworked to take out terms and conditions that this administration would say were improperly added by the last administration, like Justice 40 or DEI stuff. But really, there were no rail programs that were like specifically aimed at things that this administration, I think, will have problems with. So I don't see a huge risk of like grant programs getting clawed back or immediate quick disruption. I do think, the current boom times in grant programs is a result of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that passed in 2021. And that was a 5-year bill. So it goes through FY26. And that funding through FY24 has already been spent. So I think there's 2 more years, FY25 and 26, of relatively stable funding coming. May have some different priorities from this administration, which is perfectly normal and to be expected. Elections have consequences, and different people are in charge of the programs, and they can decide their own priorities, to the extent allowed by law. And that'll be just fine with short lines. They'll, be happy to compete under a new playing field. The bigger question would be FY27 and beyond, and that comes down to Congress and what they're willing to fund and what the administration is willing to sign. As for, not to go all, I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill, but you have to get a bill that's passed by the House, the Senate, and signed by the president. So going forward, there could be a very, very different playing field in 27 and beyond. And I would frankly say, and I don't think this is any like incredible insight by me, I think we have an uphill battle to get a similar amount of grant funding going forward that we've had the last couple of years. I would argue that the money spent on CRISI on short line projects has been incredibly well spent, a huge benefit to small town and rural America. The short line freight railroads are putting that money to use very, very effectively. It does not get wasted on bureaucracy and layers of management. We go as quickly as the government will possibly let us, and we put that money right into the ground on hard infrastructure, rail, ties, ballast, locomotives, the kind of stuff any administration would be proud to fund. And so I think we've got a great case going forward. But, we also have a $20 trillion federal deficit, and there's a lot of interest in being more fiscally responsible. And so everyone, I think, has an uphill battle going forward, and we've got our work cut out for us trying to make a successful case.
With exploring these topics, you earlier mentioned the idea of exploring best practices and how your organization has these knowledge database and committees exploring a variety of topics as well as events that you're part of. What are some of the things that you're currently involved with on those particular fronts?
So that's the way. And again, I don't think we've invented the wheel here as far as how our association structures. A lot of associations run through committees. In ours, there's a mechanical committee, an engineering committee, an HR committee, a small railroads committee, a finance committee, a legislative committee, a young professionals committee, and I'm sure I'm missing a few off the top of my head. And they do, each one's got its own sort of thing going on, right? The young professionals committee is really more about networking and finding mentors and getting 20 somethings and 30 somethings who are in the field exposed to some of the older heads who can really talk to them about career path and explain and show them paths through this industry. Whereas you take an engineering committee, and they're more about putting together, for instance, putting together a training template so that railroads can have a way to comply with the Part 243 minimum training standards on the Part 213 track safety standards engineering requirements. So there are some committees that can get very in the weeds, and then there's some committees that are more about networking and growth and sharing best practices. I'll note another activity we have that is heavily supported by the mechanical committee and the safety and training committee. Safety and training is probably our biggest and most active committee, but we have a CRISI grant that actually came to the Iowa Northern Railroad a couple years ago with the Short Line Association as the big partner. And the grant is essentially a safety training grant. And so we have set up a national, essentially, training center. Some of it's in person in Waterloo, Iowa, and some of it exists in the ether on computers, and people can train anywhere. You can log in by Zoom or Teams or go to webinar or whatever. And then sometimes we'll actually drive a simulator to you so people can train on operating, literally operating a train over whatever environment we want to stick into the simulator. And so though that program exists, and the money from the federal government is meant to fund dozens of different courses. And so we have committees that are involved in helping produce these courses. And so that's what, those are good examples of what, some of our committees spend their time on. And, I should note that all these people, they're all essentially volunteers on the committee, right? They all get paid, of course, by their companies to do their day job. And then our staff gets paid, to be a liaison, but all the work they spend on producing stuff that's for the industry is really just kind of extra time. It's not something anyone has to do to be successful at their job. And so we're really blessed by, people who just go way above and beyond, because people who are and I'm sure a lot of people listening to this podcast are like this, but people who are in the railroad industry tend to love the railroad industry, which is really cool. And we are a huge, we're a beneficiary of that. And hopefully we do a really productive version of letting people, spend that time and effort on production.
You have these initiatives going on in part because of this collective buy-in that your members are able to provide with these initiatives. Because, as you said, you only have so many staff members who can dedicate full time to these. How do you encourage entities to be able to buy in and volunteer their time to these collective initiatives? Because I imagine that's a tough thing for people to balance with their regular day job and their regular responsibilities, and how much an individual person at a company or a company as a whole can dedicate to things that aren't just for initiatives that come back to benefit them directly?
It's a great question. I will say, I don't want to pretend like it happens by magic. I will say that I'm actually amazed at how little begging we have to do to get people to do it. I think there's two reasons for that. One, I'll start with like the sort of the not cynical, but maybe just like the rational ROI on this. If you're a company in this industry, what we do on the legislative and regulatory front collectively is very, very obviously of huge benefit to your company individually. Now, it's true, of course, that they could free ride on that and just assume somebody else would do it, right? Because you get the 45G tax credit, whether you did anything to help us get it in Congress or not, right? If you're a class 3 railroad, you file your taxes, you get the credit. You didn't have to come and do any meetings. You didn't even have to be a member of the association. You didn't have to pay dues. You didn't have to help. But it's not that big of an industry. So if you're a given railroad, and I don't know, I'll make up a fake name, and you're the Ashtabula and Cleveland Railroad, you couldn't be real confident that like if you don't do anything, somebody else just has got it, right? Like it's not that big of an industry. So I think they all feel collectively like we better step up or else good results will not happen. There won't be a tax credit. There won't be Chrissy grants. There will be heavier trucks. There will be worse regulations, right? So that's all. I think they're good people. There's a sort of a collective network spirit. And then they also just get the ROI. It's like right there in front of them. It's not rocket science to understand if you're a short line that like it's helpful. And so that's kind of at the company level. And then at the individual level, you know, there's I think there's the personal ROI, right? That like the networking, the joining committees, the sharing best practices with each other. It's probably good for your own career, right? Like it helps you advance. It might help you get another job. I don't know that my members love to hear that, but certainly people like are always looking for other jobs, and sometimes that happens at conferences. People find somewhere else to get employed, and it's a free labor market, so we're all for that also. So I think it's helpful at the individual level. And then again, like they also just like railroading. I think that it's, more so than other industries. It's something that's in your blood. There's multi-generations of it. It's very, very interesting. There's always something more to learn. I've been hanging around just my own little piece of railroading for, which is just legislation and regulation and policy and legal for 20 years. And it's like 4 times a day that I come across something I didn't know. And that's not even counting all like the actual railroading. Like God knows, like if you try to put me in the cab of a locomotive, like I don't know anything. Like I wouldn't know how to build track. I don't know how to do a signal system. I wouldn't know how to do PTC. Like it's a long, long list of things I couldn't do. And so there is nobody in the industry who's like out of things to learn. Like that does not exist. And so I think they all like it and it's interesting. It's in their blood and it's good for their career. And, you take all those factors. And I guess the last one I'd add, and I thought I mentioned this earlier too, but if you're a railroad in Indiana, a short line in Indiana, and then there's a short line in Nebraska, really in no functional way are those two companies competing with each other. They're in fact really part of the same network. So they also tend to like each other, which is very, very helpful for me as an association because they're happy to be at the same conference. They have things to learn from each other. They're not risking sharing a secret with a competitor. And in fact, for the railroad in Nebraska, like they can learn something from the railroad in Indiana. And it's actually helpful if the railroad in Indiana is better. If they get one more customer, that freight goes somewhere on the rail network and it might end up terminating on their line in Nebraska. So it's it's a network business. There's network effects. They like each other. And all that kind of collectively adds up to we do pretty well with our members being involved.
My last question for you, Chuck, is at the end of the day, because of where you're at and the 20 years that you've had learning the industry from your perspective, what do you enjoy most about the nature of the work that you're involved with? And where we're sitting here in 2025, as best as any of us can prognosticate, what do you see as some of the opportunities that are out there for us as an industry to take advantage of?
Probably your first question is easier, right? What do I like the most? And I think I just actually hit on it a little bit in the last question, but I, I like our members like each other, so it creates a pleasant atmosphere within the association. And then if you go back to my earlier conversations about the origin story of short lines and what we do and the customer service they provide, the good news is that people outside of the short line industry like short lines, right? Like, and that's because of the service they provide to customers, right? Not because I'm so good at my job. But so what it means is that when I go to Congress, when I go to the FRA, when I go to the STB, when I go to the public, to the extent I go to the public, people tend to like short lines, right? So it makes my job pretty pleasant. Sometimes I ask for things that the answer is no, but I pretty much never get a hostile reaction. Even if it's no, it's like, I want to help you, but I can't. And frequently the answer is yes. And that's enjoyable to me. That sort of fits how I want to spend a career. There are versions of lobbying and trade association management in DC that are much more like hand-to-hand combat, much more hostile. And that's not how I'd like to spend my time. And the beauty of representing short lines is like I tend to be welcomed kind of wherever I go because people like short lines because they do good work for their shippers and good work for their communities. So your second question was opportunities, for the future. There's opportunities and there's threats too, right? Like the good news is we're pretty stable, right? We're coming up in 2 years, we have the 200th anniversary of freight railroading in the United States. You go back to B&O Railroad in 1827. So there are not a lot of industries that can say they've been around for 198 years. And so overall, if you zoom out to the 50,000 foot level, you'd be like, boy, that's a stable industry. Like we've been around for 200 years and we'll probably be around for another 200 years. And you could argue, and my friend Tony Hatch, who would be a fun podcast guest for you one day.
We just interviewed him.
Oh, there you go. I didn't even know that. He has a lot of great insight into the industry, and one of the things he points out is that the network itself is irreplaceable, right? Like 150,000 miles of dedicated right of way connecting essentially, every major market and small town and freight generating site in this country is an irreplaceable asset that could never be replicated. If it was lost, it could never be recreated. And so you could say, like, it would almost be, it's such a good asset that we almost can't screw it up. Sometimes we try, but like it would be hard to screw up the fact that you've got this 150,000 mile network. And there's capacity on it, especially on the short lines, but I think even the class ones would all say there's capacity. So I think there's room to grow the network. There's room to put more freight on rail. There's room to get way more efficient at it, right? We still aren't even able to tell our customers where their stuff is at all times, which, is starting to feel a little silly, right? Like if I can find where my $6.99 pepperoni pizza is on the Domino's app, people should be able to find where $300,000 worth of lumber is on their train. So there's room to get better technologically. There's room to put more freight on rail, and we have this unique network that will exist that has room to do it. And so I feel really good about it from that point of view. On the other hand, we're competing against a 4 million mile road network that literally goes to the front door of every business in the United States. It's publicly subsidized to the tune of tens of billions of dollars per year. There are millions of truckers in the United States. And there's efforts to make those trucks autonomous, which means they could run 24/7. They wouldn't be burdened by a person who actually has to sleep and rest and have a life. And then one day those trucks will be electric too, which means they won't be burdened by, fuel costs. I mean, they have different types of energy, and we'll see if the batteries, ever get there. But one day they'll probably be there, and so that's pretty stiff competition. And we need to make sure that we're as efficient as humanly possible, that we're getting infrastructure investment help whenever we can, and that we continue to get better because our competition's getting better. And if you're standing still, you're probably going backwards, right? So I think there's a lot of properly placed sense of urgency and angst in the industry that we better hurry up and get better because the competition's getting better too.
Their website is aslrra.org, where you can learn more about the initiatives that they're involved with. Chuck, thank you so much for joining us here on the Roundhouse to talk about the short line railroad industry and how you're seeing the industry on a national level.
Well, I appreciate that. This is a great interview. You do a good job, and your listeners are in good hands.
Thank you very much.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, I was the guest of sorts. I was talking about my experience hosting this podcast, commemorating 10 years of doing so. I answered a bunch of your questions, but I wanted to get around to more. So here are a few other questions that you guys submitted. Kenny Broomfield asks, if you could talk to your younger self, what would you say? Simply put, you'll get there, and it's even better than you could possibly imagine. I couldn't have envisioned being in this wonderful position of being at the helm of Streamliner Media, hosting this podcast, doing the things I get to do, and having some tremendously cool experiences. I think a lot of us, when we're young, we're impatient, we're nervous about what we're going to make of ourselves in the world. And that is what I would advise, is that you'll get there and it's even better than you think. Matthew Murawski writes, have you ever had a potential guest not want to be on your show or blow you off because it's too rail fanish, i.e., I've got a business to run, I've no time for stinking foamers? Actually, Matthew, the answer to that is no. There have been a couple of people who have turned down invitations, but not for that reason. More so to do with privacy concerns. I consider it really good fortune that I've approached so many very interesting people, and they've said yes, and they've shared their experiences with us here. Glenn Holland asks, what would you consider to be a defining moment in your Heritage Rail experience? I've thought about this one a lot. There's so many I could choose from. The one that stands out to me, because it's a case where I feel like I was able to listen to so many stories and contextualize that, is where I created the launch trailer for the East Broad Top Foundation when they purchased the railroad. And this was back in February of 2020, so 5 years ago. Man, time flies. And to take my experience as a member of the Friends of the East Broad Top, and all the stories I'd been hearing and how much I learned about how much people cared about this place, and turning that into a video about the optimism that people have felt and the opportunities that this new chapter afforded, that is one that will always stand out. And lastly, Justin Newhall says, imagine that it's the late 1940s and you are named the Minister of Railways for the new fictitious country of Albonia. However, you're a traitor and wish to see their railways fail. What locomotives do you give them to ensure their complete failure? The only caveat is that you have to be able to convince people that the locomotives you're giving them are actually a good idea. My initial reaction to this was, I would want to know more about the type of railroad that exists in Albonia, but I am going to go with having a steam triplex. Convincing them that they should order a modern version of a triplex from Baldwin or Lima, I think that would be a safe way of making something that looks cool and seems powerful, but is not effective. Very fun question. Your question of the day for this episode is, what short line or regional railroad impresses you? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. Links to social media are there. Thank you for joining us for another wonderful episode of The Roundhouse. It's always great to have you here. Remember that The Roundhouse is our house.